Okay, we're back at it.
Not written by Marcus. This suggests Marcus himself did not deem the subject important enough to write about, even in passing. From Marcus's Stoic perspective, the Christians' willingness to die for their faith might have seemed less admirable, and more a kind of fanaticism or misguided fervor. A Stoic was supposed to face death calmly for rational reasons, not in hope of heavenly reward. A hint of this view appears in Meditations 9.3, or 9.2 in some editions, where Marcus writes about the idea of a glorious death and comments that true nobility is being willing to die for a cause, but not with the aim of making a spectacle. Some have read this as a veiled critique of Christian martyrs who sought martyrdom. However, Marcus doesn't name them, and the passage is general. It is plausible Marcus lumped Christians with other obstinate sects. Later, Christian writers tried to cast Marcus in a more positive light, perhaps because they respected his philosophical reputation. An intriguing legend arose around the so-called Thundering Legion. During the Marcomannic War, in 174, Marcus's army was supposedly saved by a miraculous thunderstorm that broke a desperate drought. One account, by Cassius Dio, attributes the sudden rain to Marcus's prayers, or perhaps an Egyptian magician invoking Mercury. But later Christian apologists, notably Tertullian and Eusebius, claimed that a legion composed largely of Christian soldiers prayed to their god, and rain miraculously fell, saving the Romans and routing the enemy. They said Marcus, astonished by this divine aid, wrote a letter to the Senate thanking the Christian soldiers and requesting an end to persecution. This story, often called the rain miracle, was celebrated by Christians as proof of God's favor. The Historia Augusta even includes a version of Marcus's purported letter, in which he refers to the Christian God helping in battle.
Okay.
However, modern historians and ancient critics, like Dio's epitomizer Philinus, consider this letter a forgery, likely a pious fraud by later Christians.
Now we're good.
The Legion, Legio 12 Fulminata, did exist and had the nickname Thundering from earlier times, but there's no reliable evidence Marcus credited Christian prayer for the rain. Still, the tale indicates that in Christian memory, Marcus Aurelius was not cast as a bloodthirsty tyrant, unlike Nero or Diocletian. Tertullian, writing about 20 years after Marcus's death, actually mentions that Marcus Aurelius in the Germanic War obtained rain by the prayers of Christian soldiers, and thereafter spared Christians, a claim likely false, but showing that by the early 3rd century, some Christians believed Marcus had a change of heart. The miraculous rain event, immortalized on the column of Marcus Aurelius. On balance, Marcus Aurelius did not launch any systematic persecution of Christians that we know of.
Hammer.
Persecutions under his reign occurred, but they were probably initiated by provincial authorities or local mobs during times of crisis, when scapegoats were sought for plagues or invasions.
Well, that's an awesome
The martyrdoms of Leon in 177, of Justin in Rome, and of some others, the Silesian martyrs in North Africa in 180, may also fall in his late reign, suggest that Christians did suffer.
Safe travels.
But Marcus's own involvement seems minimal. In fact, an American scholar, Henry Sedgwick, argued that no accusation would have surprised Marcus more than the charge that he persecuted Christians. Marcus prided himself on reason and humanity. Wanton cruelty was against his character. We might imagine that had Marcus met a sensible Christian apologist, he could even have admired their fortitude, though he would not agree with their faith.
No.
Ironically, Marcus's Stoicism shares certain ethical common ground with Christianity, emphasis on kindness, forgiveness, humility. Yet Stoicism and Christianity also diverged sharply on theology and the source of virtue. Marcus, as a pagan Pontifex Maximus, would uphold the traditional gods and rituals. Christians' denial of those gods and refusal to participate in sacrifice would strike him as obstinacy that threatened the social order and the favor of the deities.
We're cooking with gas, guys.
In Meditations 11.12, Marcus writes about living according to nature and cooperating with what the Logos, divine reason, ordains. He would likely view Christianity as contrary to the inherited wisdom of Greco-Roman tradition, perhaps just another cult, albeit one whose members strangely welcome death.
Be good.
In summary, under Marcus Aurelius, the legal policy on Christians remained what it had
Okay,
been.
let's go.
Christianity was a punishable superstition, but there was no general hunt for Christians. Marcus himself allowed persecutions in line with law, and some governors during the stresses of his reign did clamp down harder on Christians, the Lyon events being the prime example. But Marcus did not make Christianity a focus of his attention. As Gregory Hayes remarks, during Marcus's reign, Christianity was a troublesome cult, but dwarfed by more pressing concerns, war and plague, and there is no reason to think it bulked large in his mind. Any portrayal of Marcus as a dedicated persecutor is anachronistic and not supported by primary evidence. Indeed, later Christian writers like Eusebius, while recording martyrdoms under Marcus, do not vilify him personally. The Church of Rome even legendarily regarded him kindly due to the fictional rain miracle letter. Thus, Marcus Aurelius's legacy vis-a-vis Christianity
Don't
is
be dying.
complex.
Oop.
He was a persecutor by default of position, but not by zeal or initiative. In the tapestry of his life, the Christian question was a relatively minor thread, one overshadowed by the far greater tapestry of Stoic philosophy that Marcus wove in his meditations.
Marcus was an alright guy.
Philosophy and the Meditations. Marcus Aurelius's enduring fame rests not only on his deeds as emperor, but on his mind, particularly the philosophical reflections he left behind in his private writings,
My judgment's
today
pretty
known
good.
as the Meditations. These personal notebooks were never meant for publication. Marcus wrote them primarily for self-improvement and solace during the trying latter years of his reign. Yet they survive as one of the most treasured works of Stoic philosophy, offering a rare direct window into the thoughts of a ruler. To understand the Meditations, one must see how Marcus's life experiences and Stoic training converged. Philosophy for Marcus was always a practical pursuit, a design for living, not an abstract academic field. In the ancient world, and especially for Stoics, philosophy was about ethics and self-discipline, providing guidance on how to live virtuously, cope with adversity, and fulfill one's duties. Marcus had embraced this
Quick
outlook
heal.
from his youth, influenced by Stoic
Alright.
teachers and texts. He was particularly inspired by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a former slave whose discourses taught that one should focus on what is within one's control, one's own judgments and actions, and accept what is not external events with equanimity. Marcus explicitly thanks Rusticus for introducing him to Epictetus's lectures, which likely became a template for his own thought. The Stoicism Marcus practiced was a late Roman Stoicism, influenced by Epictetus and also by earlier Stoics like Seneca. It emphasized endurance, rationality, and alignment with nature's order, logos. Marcus believed profoundly that the universe was governed by a rational providence, or logos, and that his own rational soul was
Rumble
literally
shots
a
ammo.
fragment of the divine
There,
logos.
bunny.
This idea, as A. Long and Pierre Hadot have noted, could lead to a kind of spiritual perspective in Marcus, seeing oneself as part of a larger cosmic whole, akin to a citizen of the universe, rather than just a Roman voter. The Meditations, Marcus probably titled it to himself in Greek, were composed during the Marcomannic Wars, especially in the years 170 to 175, while he was campaigning along the Danube. The emperor wrote in Greek, sometimes in the form of aphorisms, sometimes in longer trains of thought, to reinforce Stoic principles in his own mind. He would jot down reminders to live by virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. One famous passage, Meditations 2.1, has Marcus prepping himself each morning to meet meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly people. A likely
I think we can all relate to that.
Dealing with difficult courtiers, soldiers, or petitioners, and resolving not to be angry with them because they act out of ignorance of good and evil. Such counsel was no abstract musing. It was Marcus psyching himself up to deal calmly with constant interpersonal frustrations. Many of his entries deal with handling pain, fear, and the imminence of death. He writes about clinging to life like men who love it, versus accepting death when duty calls. Obviously,
Quick heal.
as he was literally
And we gotta be
on the front
careful in
lines
this
of
cave.
battle and disease.
We gotta be damn careful.
one moving passage, he tells himself to imagine he is already dead and living on borrowed time, to value each moment. The depth of resignation and resolve in his writing mirrors what he was going through. Losing comrades to plague, hearing news of distant revolts, suffering his own illnesses, and not knowing if he'd see Rome again. Philosophy was Marcus's refuge, an ointment for the soul's eyes, as he says, bringing clarity and healing. The meditations entries were, in Haydote's term, spiritual exercises, a form of therapy Marcus applied to himself daily. Rather than novel theories, he obsessively repeats and reframes ideas long familiar but imperfectly absorbed. This repetitive, almost mantra-like quality, Marcus
Oh, I need
returning
blessing
again
of
and
light.
again to the brevity of life,
Silly
the unity
me.
of nature, the importance of duty, indicates he was strengthening his soul through practice. In essence, the hardships of his reign shaped the meditations. Without those trials, we might not have the same poignant insights. As Gregory Hayes notes, the 170s were a dark and stressful period for Marcus. Constant war, the revolt of Cassius, deaths of loved ones, and that in these circumstances, Marcus should have sought consolation
guy
in
helped me.
philosophy is only natural. Marcus's experiences directly influenced key Stoic themes he emphasized.
For the hand.
For example, impermanence. Ruling an empire at its apex, he saw how even Rome's glory was transient, how emperors before him, even the great Augustus and Trajan, were now mere memories. In Meditations, he lists great men of old, Heraclitus, Socrates, heroes of legend, and reminds himself that all are long dead and that fame is fleeting. Such reflections likely were sharpened by seeing whole communities perish from plague or towns destroyed in war. Another example is cosmopolitanism. Marcus often writes about adopting the point of view of the cosmos, imagining the earth from above, or oneself as part of the cosmic city. One entry has him say, "Frequently consider the connection of all things in the universe and their relationship to one another." This could well stem from nights on campaign under the vast
Kill these
stars,
guys.
or his
Will they
initiation at Eleusis, expanding his spiritual horizon. The rigors of war also taught him the Stoic lesson of focusing on the present task. He quotes or paraphrases Epictetus, "Don't let the future disturb you. You will meet it if you have to, with the same weapons of reason you're using now."
Level 6, guys.
7.8. It is easy to imagine Marcus writing that in a military tent, mastering anxiety about tomorrow's battle by grounding himself in the here and now. Marcus's meditations also reveal how he integrated what he learned from others. But one of the meditations is essentially an acknowledgement of debts. He lists what he learned from various family members and teachers, from his mother,
Okay, this
piety
is gonna
and
get
generosity,
hairy.
from Rusticus, to avoid sophistry and to read carefully, and to keep Epictetus's books handy, from Apollonius, self-discipline and equanimity,
I gotta help
from
this
Fronto,
poor guy.
the importance of sincere friendship, from Antoninus, patience,
Goddamn.
and an orderly life. This self-assessment shows how the people in Marcus's early life planted seeds that bore fruit in his philosophy. It also underlines Marcus's humility. He attributes every good trait in himself to someone else's influence, a very Stoic modesty about the self. Indeed, Marcus never claims originality or brilliance as a philosopher. He never thought of himself as a philosopher, Hayes writes. Marcus saw himself at best as a diligent student and very imperfect practitioner of others' ideas. This humility in the face of philosophy is genuine in his text. He chides himself for not living up to Stoic ideals fully. He writes, "Get busy with life's purpose. Toss aside empty hopes. Get active in
You gotta be very careful when we can.
3.14, as if berating himself for procrastination or weakness. The style of the meditations is straightforward and earnest, reflecting Marcus's personality. There is little flowery rhetoric, despite his training with Fronto. The tone is intimate, frank, and sometimes austere, more like a diary of moral exercises than a polished literary work. Modern scholars like A.A. long emphasized that Marcus's writing lacks systematic argument because it was not meant to teach others, but to remind himself of Stoic tenets in the face of daily pressures. In Long's analysis, Marcus is grappling with the question of the self, how to define one's inner self when one's roles, emperor, father, general, and even one's body are ephemeral. Marcus often reduces the self to the hegemonicon, the ruling mind within, which must remain pure and in harmony with nature. Through his tribulations, Marcus seems at times to reach a kind of mystical intuition of merging with the larger cosmos, but at other times his tone is sorrowful, as if struggling to find meaning. A.A. Long and others have noted a pessimistic or melancholic strain in Marcus, unsurprising given the sorrow he saw, yet also an admiration for how he maintained rationality and virtue in spite of it. One senses an emotional undercurrent in passages where Marcus reminds himself not to complain or not to fear death. These were perhaps pep talks against his own moments of despair or anxiety. Philosophically, Marcus Aurelius is not breaking new ground so much as living out Stoicism in an imperial context. If earlier Stoics like Zeno or Chrysippus built the grand edifice of Stoic theory, Marcus was inhabiting it and doing repairs where needed. He sometimes borrows eclectic ideas. For instance, he occasionally mentions the soul's possible dispersal or reabsorption into the cosmos, an idea compatible with Stoic physics, but also resonant with Platonic thought. He frequently invokes providence versus the atomic randomness of Epicureanism, concluding that either a wise providence or mere atoms rule the universe. In either case, a Stoic should live morally, med. 4.3.
Should live morally.
Dialogue with
That's
contemporary
right.
philosophical turns. But always he returns to the
And not let people die and feel bad
virtue
about it.
is the only true good, vice the only evil, and everything else, health, wealth, reputation, even life or death, is indifferent and to be met with moderation.
Truth is the only true good.
Marcus's unique
I agree.
contribution was to demonstrate Stoic kingship in action. He arguably fulfilled Plato's ideal of the philosopher king more than anyone before, even though Marcus himself would modestly reject that title. He liked to quote Plato's dictum that states will never be happy until rulers become philosophers or philosophers become rulers. And while he lived, many felt that in Marcus this ideal was realized. The Meditations can be read as the inner voice of a ruler striving to be wise and just. In one passage, Marcus reminds himself to behave as a civil magistrate in all things, to fulfill his social duty with perfect justice. Ed. 6.30, a sketch of Antoninus Pius's virtues. His philosophical meditations are directly tied to his role. When he exhorts himself to waste no more time arguing what a good man should be.
Okay, we're
B1
gonna get this guy.
at 10.16, we see an emperor exhorting himself to action aligned with his ethical ideals. Indeed, many of his reflections on kindness, forgiveness, and self-restraint have clear application to how he dealt with subordinates, enemies, or the temptations of absolute
Well,
power.
we're doing good.
It is telling that after crushing the Avidius Cassius revolt, Marcus was extremely merciful. He did not execute Cassius's co-conspirators en masse, and even the rebel general's family was spared. The Senate, in fact, was worried. Marcus's leniency would pave the way for similar uprisings. But Marcus chose clemency, a virtue both Stoics and Antoninus Pius prized.
Clemency is a
Meditations
risk,
had repeatedly
but
counseled
long term
forgiveness
it's
and
the best
understanding, he
strategy.
writes. When a person does wrong, remember they act out of conviction of what seems true to them, etc. Thus we see philosophy translating into policy. Marcus's measured
Someone
humane
does
approach
wrong,
largely
they're
avoided
acting
bloody
to what
purges
seems
and
true.
judicial
That's
wars
pretty
that
wise.
stained the record of many emperors. Another example, Marcus often speaks about luxury and simplicity. He lived relatively plainly for an emperor, and when war demanded it, he had no qualms about selling palace luxuries. The Stoic disdain for excess comfort thus bolstered his ability to endure privation on campaign and make hard economic choices. During his lifetime, Marcus's devotion to philosophy was well known.
Let's avoid those
Some
baddies.
court gossip might have found it odd, the image of the emperor at night in his tent writing in Greek about the meaning of life. But for many, it was admirable.
Oh god.
There's a story in the Historia Augusta that before Marcus left for the Marcomannic War, friends urged him to publish his philosophical maxims, called precepts, discussing his doctrines with them. This anecdote, though of uncertain reliability, at least suggests his peers were aware of his writings. If anything, Marcus might have feared that making them public would seem vainglorious, or that they were too unpolished. After his death, the notebooks were preserved,
I could
first by
hearth,
his daughter
but
or scribes.
I don't want to go back to
copies
Cold Ridge
eventually
Valley. I forgot to
circulated in
update my
Greek.
hearth.
We know that by a century later, scholars like Themistius, circa 364 AD, referred to Marcus's exhortations,
Well,
and by the 10th century, the work was explicitly
suppose
mentioned by
the die is
name in
cast.
exhortations to himself in the pseudo-lexicon. Thus, Marcus's private philosophy did become public legacy. The Meditations has inspired readers in every
Oh, a
era
scroll of
precisely
spirit.
because it was forged in the
Yeah,
fire
let's
of
use that.
real-world trials.
I could use some spirit.
As one modern scholar put it, it's easy to write about serenity in a villa. It's harder to actually practice wisdom in a world of chaos and flux. Yet Marcus managed to do that, at least to a remarkable degree. Readers from antiquity to today admire the Meditations because it speaks to the universal human condition, facing pain, loss, fear, and one's own moral shortcomings, from the perspective of someone who had immense responsibility and yet remained intensely human in his reflections. This is perhaps why the work has always exerted a fascination on those outside the narrow orbit of classical study, especially those who can appreciate the pressures Marcus himself faced. Frederick the Great of
61, one
Prussia,
block.
an 18th century warrior
Oh,
king,
that's a
reportedly
better
kept
shield.
the Meditations at his bedside. In
It's a better
modern
shield.
times, statesmen and generals have drawn lessons
Oh,
from it.
and I'm
The
fighting.
recent American president, Bill Clinton, cited it
God.
as a book he rereads frequently. Philosophers and poets, from Goethe to Matthew Arnold, have found in Marcus's words a rare sincerity and comfort. In Marcus's own day, how did his philosophical bent influence public perception? Cassius Dio offers an intriguing perspective. He says Marcus did not have the fortune he deserved because of all his hardships. But I, for my part, admire him all the more for this very reason, that amid unusual and extraordinary difficulties, he survived and preserved the empire.
Let's make sure this guy
Dio,
doesn't
a
need
senator
help.
who valued traditional Roman virtues, clearly respected Marcus's stoic endurance. The Historia
Need to get
Augusta
out.
begins Marcus's biography by lauding him as preeminent among emperors in purity of life, devoted to philosophy
people
as
that-
long as he lived.
Maybe if I help that
This is
priest,
high
she'll
praise.
help me.
To call an emperor philosophical was to
Yes.
liken him to a sage king. Thus, contemporaries
Got
and
that
near
all sweet, sweet
contemporaries
buff.
acknowledged Marcus Aurelius as a uniquely philosophical ruler, one whose life of the mind enhanced, rather than detracted from, his effectiveness as emperor. Death and succession. Marcus Aurelius died on the 17th of March, 180, in his military camp at Vindobona. According to the sources, as Marcus lay on his deathbed, he gathered his officers and may have even said, "Do not mourn me. Think instead of the pestilence and the deaths of so many others." A final Stoic injunction. He reportedly offered words of advice to his son Commodus and the army, urging unity and duty. Upon his passing, the soldiers were deeply grieved. The Senate in Rome, when it received the news, accorded Marcus the honor of deification, placing him among the gods as Divus Marcus. Statues and altars were erected. Later, a column, the column of Marcus Aurelius, was dedicated to his victories and memory, much as Trajan's column stands for Trajan. Commodus, now sole emperor, accompanied his father's ashes back to Rome, where they were interred in Hadrian's mausoleum.
get a few more,
alongside those of
bear ribs.
Antoninus Pius and Faustina. In the immediate aftermath, Marcus's death was widely seen as the end of an era of good governance. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing a couple of decades later, lamented Marcus's passing in famous words. He did not meet with the good fortune he deserved, for he was not strong in body and was involved in a multitude of troubles throughout practically his entire reign. But for my part, I admire him all the more because of this, that amid extraordinary difficulties he both survived himself and preserved the empire. Dio's admiration is telling. He implies that fortune did not favor Marcus, giving him plagues and wars. Yet Marcus's virtue shone all the brighter against that dark background. To Dio and many of his class, the senatorial elite. Marcus Aurelius was the ideal emperor, against whom successors would be unfavorably measured. Commodus, by contrast, would be remembered as a disaster. Initially, there may have been hope. After all, Commodus had been educated similarly and was beloved by Marcus. But Commodus swiftly abandoned his father's disciplined policies. He concluded a hasty peace with the Marcomanni, probably paying them off, undoing Marcus's plans for deeper security. He then returned to Rome and indulged in games, gladiatorial combats, participating himself, and a life of ease. Within a few years, Commodus was acting more like a capricious Eastern despot than a Roman statesman, even renaming Rome after himself. Emperor Commodus.
Commodus renamed Rome? I didn't know that. That's
with Hercules symbols. Marble statue
pretty
from Esquilino Hill.
Pretty lame.
About 190 AD. The stark difference led later historians to dramatize the contrast. The virtuous philosopher father versus the degenerate tyrant son. The Historia Augusta draws this contrast sharply, saying Commodus's many defects were only emphasized by the contrast with his father. Cassius Dio even remarks that Commodus's reign marked the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of fire and rust. In essence, Marcus's death is often taken as the end of the Pax Romana. Indeed, the esteemed 18th century historian Edward Gibbon famously wrote that the period of the five good emperors, Nerva through Marcus Aurelius,
we got our ribs.
96 to 180 AD,
Let's go
was
turn
the
these
happiest
things
and
in.
most prosperous period the world has ever seen. And that after
Oh, I
Marcus,
think we'll go to
the
Iron
empire began to
Forge and
decline. Gibbon declared that if someone were to fix a time when the condition of the human race was at its best,
call it a day.
he
We'll
would,
be going to
without
the human
hesitation,
lands next.
name that period which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of
We'll
Commodus.
come back here
In other words,
later on.
Marcus's death was a fulcrum where the golden age tipped toward darkness. While modern historians recognize that the decline was not so immediate or causally simple, Marcus's reign did coincide with the end of an era of relative stability and the beginning of a more crisis-ridden age.
What's on
Posthumous reputation and legacy.
Great, more ammo.
Marcus Aurelius'
Old
posthumous
shipment
reputation
finally
has
came
been
through.
extraordinary.
The ammo might be late.
Later
but just
generations,
like my granddaddy
Roman,
used to tell me,
medieval, and modern,
it's better.
have almost universally
Thank
esteemed
you
him
much,
as a model
adventurer.
ruler.
Well, let's
I
watch
already
this
have
thing
fighters
shoot.
eager for
The
this
image
stuff.
of Marcus Aurelius evolved through time, but certain core aspects remained: his wisdom, his justice, and his status as the philosopher emperor. In late antiquity, Marcus was idealized by both pagan and Christian writers. The pagan historian Herodian, early 3rd century, begins his history with Marcus's death, portraying him as a paragon of virtue whose passing plunged Rome into woe. He writes that Marcus was concerned with all aspects of excellence, second to none in his love of knowledge, and that his own writings, which have come down to us, show his learning, likely a reference to meditations or his letters. The Historia Augusta, 4th century, in its Vita of Marcus is glowing, though its value is mixed due to fictional elements. Even the often critical Cassius Dio, as we saw, could not withhold admiration for Marcus. In the same vein, the orator Themistius in 364 AD urged the Emperor Valens to emulate Marcus Aurelius, saying essentially, "You do not need the exhortations of Marcus, because Valens should already know how Marcus ruled with fraternal love." Such references
You have a
suggest that
target?
Marcus's meditations, or exhortations,
I've actually never
were
sat
known
through
and
and watched
cited as a
this.
source of moral guidance by the
dialogue.
4th century. In the Christian tradition, opinion on Marcus Aurelius was generally favorable, especially compared to other Roman emperors. Church historians like Eusebius, early 4th century, documented the martyrdoms under Marcus, but did not blame Marcus personally. They tended to see him as a basically just emperor, under whose reign unfortunate persecutions happened. As noted, an apocryphal letter had Marcus praising Christian soldiers, which, even if forged, indicates Christians wanted him on their side.
Fire!
Later Christian writers, such as Augustine in the early 5th century, mention Marcus Aurelius in passing.
This is
Augustine
my
in City of God
boomstick!
lists him among wise emperors, and notes that, despite being virtuous, he did not prevent the decline of Roman religion. Augustine's argument being that even good pagans could not secure eternal happiness. But significantly, Marcus was never demonized by the church the way some emperors, like Decius or Diocletian, were. This allowed his philosophical work to be transmitted through Christian hands without being seen as inimical to Christianity. The Meditations itself survived in the Eastern, Greek-speaking, empire monastic circles. We know that by the 9th century, the scholar Bishop Aretas of Caesarea owned a copy and wrote about it to a friend, calling it the most profitable book of the Emperor Marcus. Aretas helped ensure its copying. Byzantine anthologies also preserved snippets. The Suda, 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, had an entry summarizing Marcus's book as the directing of his own life in 12 books. The text thus passed into the medieval period mostly in Greek. In the Latin West, knowledge of Marcus Aurelius's writings was scanty for a long time. Latin authors had Seneca and Cicero as their philosophical touchstones,
I
more than
think
Marcus.
I've seen enough.
However, Marcus's image as one of the great Roman emperors persisted. Medieval compilers included
That goes on for entirely too long.
For instance, some versions of the Nine Worthies concept, a medieval trope listing great heroes, occasionally counted Marcus Aurelius among the worthy Romans, though more often they chose the more martial figures like Julius Caesar or Trajan. Wilhelm Seilander, first Latin edition of Meditations, 1558 or 1559. It was really the Renaissance that rediscovered Marcus Aurelius in full. In 1558 or 1559, the first printed edition of the Meditations was published in Zurich by Wilhelm Seilander, a Latin translation from a now lost Greek manuscript. This editio princeps made Marcus's wisdom accessible to Western scholars. Zeilander's Latin edition was quickly followed by vernacular translations. The humanist Justus Lipsius, who led a Stoic revival in the late 16th century, held Marcus in high esteem, and may have been influenced by his Stoicism when advising rulers. In the same era, painters and writers often included Marcus as the embodiment of the philosopher king. For example, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the character of Prince Hamlet is at one point said to have the eye of Mars and the station of the herald Mercury.
What's on your
And the
mind?
combination of form and merit in which every god did seem to set his seal, a roundabout way to call him a paragon, though not explicitly referencing Marcus. The idea of the ideal princely virtues was in circulation, and Marcus exemplified those for many thinkers influenced by classical ideas. Machiavelli, 16th century, discussed Marcus Aurelius in his Discourses on Livy, praising the era of the 5 good emperors for their virtue and reliance on adoption rather than heredity, which ensured meritocratic succession. Machiavelli noted that these emperors, including Marcus, were esteemed because they governed well and lived securely, contrasting them sharply with emperors who inherited the throne, often leading to ruin like under Commodus, or those who gained power.
Level 7.
In The Prince, chapter 19, while discussing how emperors maintain power, Machiavelli implicitly reinforces this idea by highlighting the stability provided by emperors beloved for their virtue, like Marcus, as opposed to those relying solely on force or feared for their cruelty. Thus, for Machiavelli, the success of rulers like Marcus underscored the wisdom of adoptive succession based on merit, suggesting the perceived mistake was not Marcus's rule itself, but the reversion to hereditary succession with his son Commodus.
You show a lot of grit.
During the Enlightenment, Marcus Aurelius' star shone even brighter. Enlightenment philosophes, many of whom were deists or secular moralists, admired Marcus as a model of rational morality.
Let's see what sort of training is available.
Edward Gibbon eulogized the age of the Antonines in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he singles out Marcus Aurelius as a ruler whose life was the noblest commentary on the precepts of Zeno. Zeno being the founder of Stoicism, essentially saying Marcus's reign exemplified Stoic philosophy in action.
Awesome. So we've got
asserted that the period of Nerva to Marcus was the happiest for humanity.
protection.
That view held sway for a long time.
Train
Thomas
that.
Paine and other revolutionary thinkers also cited
Holy
Marcus
Light.
Aurelius as proof that virtue and governance can align
keep that
even
here,
absent
that's too
revealed
special.
religion.
Seal the
In the
Crusader.
19th century,
3.
Matthew Arnold wrote an essay on the gentleness and perfection of Marcus Aurelius, calling him perhaps perhaps the most beautiful soul to ever wear a crown. Arnold, a poet and cultural critic, was deeply moved by Marcus's introspective nobility and saw him as a saintly figure of pagan virtue. Similarly, Ernest Renan, a French historian,
Guess I'll
wrote
sit
an
up here.
influential study of Marcus, praising his meditations as the gospel of those who do not
A
believe in
book
the
to read. The
supernatural.
Alliance of Lord. I never noticed the
Stoicism
girl
saw a
up
minor
there.
revival in Victorian
That's
times among
funny.
moralists who valued self-restraint and duty, and Marcus was frequently quoted.
All
In the
right.
modern era, Marcus Aurelius remains widely respected.
Well, thank you for listening, and stay stoic, everyone.